we need to remember that what is happening in Iraq is primarily violence by the terrorist group formerly known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which is now morphed in some form to what we call ISIS or ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Iraq and the Levant. And this violence is primarily directed against Shia civilians. Now, there are other flavors of violence. We have neo-Ba'athist parties in Iraq that are part of the violence. We have other targets of ISIS, the government security forces, the more moderate Sunnis, but primarily, some percentage of the violence, it's hard to parse, but well above 70%, is from AQI, ISIS, and directed against Shia civilians. And that's important for us to remember. This is not primarily groups of Iraqis fighting each other anymore, as we had in 2007, 2008. This is primarily a radical Islamist terrorist group killing Shia civilians almost exclusively with car bombs. We do have low-level background violence, of course, that occurs. Iraq remains a violent place, and to say that this is just a terrorism problem is not true. But we need to keep this in perspective. According to the Iraq body count in 2012, before the Syrian war really kicked up, there were about 4,400 casualties in Iraq, a country of about 30 million people. As I like to point, this compares disfavorably with the 500 murder victims that occurred in the city of Chicago with its 2 million population. So we need to keep in perspective what the background violence is in Iraq and how much of this is terrorism related. Second point, while the government of Iraq is not perfect, it is not causal of this violence. There are lots of factions who would like to blame all this violence on the Shia government, on Prime Minister Maliki in particular, on his policies towards the Sunnis. Lots of people like to describe the Sunnis as disenfranchised, although that's not true. Iraq is one of the countries in the region where the minority sect actually does have political rights, the rights to vote, the right to hold government offices, the right to be in the military, and so on. You can look at other countries in the region and see that that's not true for their minority groups. But again, while the government of Iraq has not been perfect, and I'm not here to endorse or give credence to all their actions, it's simply false to say that that's causal. We could remove, take our magic wand, remove Maliki from office tomorrow, put in a prominent Sunni figure like Ayad Alawi or Salah Mutlaq or one of the new Jafis, make them the prime minister, and this would impact ISIL's calculus not in the least. They would continue to send car bombs against Shia civilians because they want a radically different system in Iraq, and simply putting some Sunni in charge would not satisfy them in the least. Third, I think it's important to remember that there are trends in Iraq that counter this violence, that there are sources of order inside Iraq that are actually uniquely encouraging. One, of course, remains the oil. It is hard to talk about Iraq without talking about its hydrocarbons, without talking about its oil. In some senses, of course, a resource like this is a problem. We all know the term resource curse. But on the other side, Iraq has the resources, the funding source, to do all kinds of things that it needs to do to one day, as it stabilizes, develop a more diversified economy, and in the short term, simply to buy its way out of problems. This is a time-honored tradition in the region. If you're having a problem, you give a leader of this group money, and money can be used to diminish violence and buy political allies. Second, and a little less sordidly, there is an emerging democratic tradition in Iraq. Now, we have not seen this at the central government, admittedly. The politics in Baghdad are messy, they're ugly, primarily because we have three divergent groups with very, very different interests, and it's very, very hard for them to find common ground. However, in the provinces, we've now gone through two successful electoral cycles where ballots are counted, the vote is rather uncontroversial, people who were in power who tried to get another term do not succeed are ejected from office and go back more or less peacefully to what they were doing beforehand. For example, in the province of Basra, before the 2009 provincial elections, Fallujah, the Islamic Virtue Party, was the guy. They had the governor of Basra. The governor was from that party. The 2009 elections saw State of Law, Maliki's party, win the Basra elections, and they provided the governor. And then in the 2013, State of Law lost the elections in Basra, and there is now a governor with a party called the Citizens Alliance, which is affiliated with ISKI, the party of the Hakims. In all these cases, the prior governors remain in private life. I believe both of them are still in Basra, although I'm not confident of that. And certainly other people in their political circles are. We have had peaceful transition of power at the provinces, not once, but twice. And this should give us hope about the future of democracy in Iraq. So what do we need to do? And what can the United States do? Which was one of the questions we were presented with. I think we need to look at, we need to acknowledge that we need to support Iraq against external forces while acknowledging that there are difficult politics in the country. First, we need to acknowledge Iraq as a fellow victim of al-Qaeda terrorism. Iraq and the United States have the dubious distinction of being the two countries that have suffered the most from al-Qaeda terrorism. Well, Syria now clearly joining that group. But we need to acknowledge that that's their problem, and it's not a dissimilar one to ours. Second, I just mentioned Syria. We need to acknowledge that Iraq is also a victim of fallout from the Syria problem. I'm not here to say that I know what should be done in Syria or that I could have done better than the current government, but that doesn't change the fact that we can all acknowledge Syria is a mess and it's bleeding over into the region all around it. So what can we do? We can sell arms to Iraq. This has all types of virtue. One, Iraq needs these weapons against al-Qaeda. That's very, very clear. We had Deputy Assistant Secretary McGurk testify to the House Armed Services Committee last week, I believe, that Iraq has flown its lightly armed helicopters against ISIL bases in the Western Desert, and they have high-powered, long-range machine guns that they use against these lightly armed helicopters and have shot them down and have wounded and even killed some of the crew members that we spent a lot of time training. They need better weapons to fight against this type of foe. This has two other virtues. We need to give Iraq more weapons so that it can stand up to Iran. We've been concerned for a long time about Iranian influence in Iraq. Part of the issue with Iranian influence in Iraq is that Iran is incredibly militarily superior to Iraq. We've been complaining about overflights from Iran to Syria through Iraqi airspace for some time. When you speak to the Iraqis casually about this, their question is, what do you want us to do? Throw rocks. We have no air defense system. We have no air force. Now, you could ask them to, very kindly, not to fly aircraft through their airspace. But, in international diplomacy, you don't ask people to do things that you can't back up with force if required. In the United States, we ask people nicely not to fly through our airspace. Implicit in that is if you fly through our airspace without permission, we're going to send F-16s out to force those planes down. Iraq does not currently have this luxury. If you look at the recent military balance sheet that was produced by CSIS and shows the Iranian and Iraqi balance in, for example, tanks prior to the US invasion, prior to 2003, and shows it now, Iraq and Iran were more or less at parity, with a slight Iraqi advantage before the 2003 invasion. Today, there is a huge Iranian advantage in conventional military power on that border. And to think that that does not influence the politics is simply folly. And finally, America selling weapons to Iraq has the added benefit of supporting our defense industrial base during what is clearly going to be a coming lean period for the industry. We're going to need that industrial base again someday. It would be nice if someone could keep it open for us in the meantime. Finally, what else can America do for Iraq? It can help continue its integration into the region. The region continues to be suspicious of Iraq for a whole host of reasons. Primarily because it is a state that is clearly run by its Shia majority, and other states in the region see that as meaning that they're an Iranian proxy. We can talk about how much of that is true, but we can certainly help to change that reality and work to continue their integration into the region as a fellow Arab state. Note that in neither of these cases have I implied that the United States should give money to Iraq. The Iraqis are pumping plenty of oil, they have plenty of money, they don't need ours. Nor have I said that American military forces should return to Iraq. Both those things are and should be off the table. The Iraqis do not need American money. They neither need nor want American troops back in Iraq. We can do lots of things short of those two going either of those places, sending taxpayer money to Iraq or sending American forces to Iraq, both of which have the virtue of sharing the fact that they are neither a good idea nor politically possible.